She thinks I can't remember my own name anymore, Margaret Whitmore whispered to herself one quiet morning, watching her daughter-in-law carefully carry a small velvet jewelry box out of the bedroom that had belonged to Margaret and her late husband for more than 35 years. Margaret Whitmore was 72 years old, a widow who had spent most of her life in the same two-story colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive in a quiet Ohio suburb where the sidewalks were wide, the lawns were trimmed every Saturday morning, and neighbors still waved from their front porches. To anyone who saw her recently, Margaret looked exactly like a fragile elderly woman whose memory had begun to fade. She sometimes asked the same question twice, occasionally forgot where she left her reading glasses, and once even stared at the microwave clock as if she could not remember what the glowing numbers meant. But what no one in the house realized, especially not Ashley Whitmore, the confident 38-year-old woman who had married Margaret's son Daniel, was that Margaret's confusion was not real. It was a performance. Margaret had started the act 3 weeks earlier, after noticing small but troubling changes in Ashley's behavior. Drawers left slightly open in Margaret's study, papers on the desk rearranged, and one afternoon the faint sound of a camera shutter coming from the hallway where Ashley stood photographing framed family heirlooms that had hung untouched for decades. At first Margaret told herself it was harmless curiosity, but the feeling in her chest told her otherwise. A quiet instinct that something in her home was shifting in a way she could not ignore. So Margaret did something unexpected. She decided to become invisible. She allowed Ashley to believe that the elderly widow who once managed every detail of the household now lived in a soft fog of forgetfulness. Margaret repeated stories, asked Daniel what year it was, and once stood in the living room pretending to search for a purse she was already holding. Ashley's reactions were subtle at first. Longer glances, a thoughtful silence, and then a polite smile that lingered just a little too long. Over the next few days Ashley began moving through the house differently, opening cabinets that had always remained closed, lifting the lids of antique boxes, studying old documents that Margaret had kept carefully organized since the 1980s. From the outside it looked like a helpful daughter-in-law, managing the affairs of an aging relative. But Margaret saw something else entirely. She saw calculation. She saw someone slowly measuring the value of everything in the house, from the silverware inherited from Margaret's grandmother to the framed photographs that quietly marked the passing of 40 years. And each evening, when the house settled into silence and the streetlights glowed across Maple Ridge Drive, Margaret Whitmore sat quietly in her armchair by the window, perfectly still, pretending to struggle with her fading memory while her mind remained sharper than it had been in years, because Margaret had made a decision the moment she realized what Ashley believed. If Ashley wanted to take advantage of a woman who could not remember anything, Margaret would give her exactly that illusion, and then she would wait patiently to see just how much Ashley Whitmore was willing to take. Over the next several days the quiet house on Maple Ridge Drive settled into a strange new routine, one that Ashley Whitmore seemed increasingly comfortable controlling while Margaret Whitmore continued her careful performance of confusion. Each morning Margaret shuffled slowly into the kitchen wearing the same pale blue cardigan and asked the same gentle question as if she had never asked it before, wondering aloud whether Daniel had already left for work and whether it was Tuesday or Thursday, and Ashley would answer with patient politeness that sounded helpful on the surface but carried a faint tone of amusement that Margaret did not miss. Margaret moved slowly through the house, sometimes pausing in the hallway as if she had forgotten where she was going, sometimes opening a drawer and staring inside it for a moment longer than necessary before closing it again, always careful to make her uncertainty believable but never exaggerated. Ashley began taking advantage of these quiet moments almost immediately. One afternoon Margaret sat in the living room pretending to struggle with a crossword puzzle, while Ashley walked through the house with a small notebook and her phone, stopping in the dining room to photograph a set of antique silver serving trays that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother since the early 1940s. Margaret noticed how Ashley held the tray up to the window to catch the sunlight, studying the engraved initials and the delicate pattern around the edges, as if she were evaluating something far more important than a family keepsake. Later, that same day Ashley entered Margaret's study where the old wooden desk still held decades of organized files, insurance documents, and the carefully labeled folders that Margaret had maintained since Daniel was a child. Margaret watched from the hallway with the distant expression of someone who could not quite remember why the room mattered, while Ashley quietly opened drawers and scanned documents with her phone one page at a time. The sound of each photograph was soft, barely more than a click, but to Margaret it sounded as clear as a clock ticking in an otherwise silent room. What surprised Margaret most was how quickly Ashley grew comfortable with this new freedom. Within a week, Ashley moved through the house like someone conducting a quiet inventory, opening the cedar chest at the foot of Margaret's bed, examining the old gold wristwatch that had once belonged to Margaret's late husband Thomas, and even removing framed certificates from the wall long enough to check the backs for anything that might have been hidden behind them. Whenever Ashley noticed Margaret nearby, she immediately softened her voice and smiled kindly, asking gentle questions like whether Margaret wanted tea or whether she remembered where she had placed her reading glasses earlier that morning. Margaret always answered slowly, sometimes shaking her head as if the world around her had become foggy and distant. But inside her mind every detail remained clear and sharp. She noticed the way Ashley locked the study door when Daniel was not home. She noticed the growing stack of printed papers Ashley kept inside a leather folder. She noticed that Ashley had started checking the mailbox earlier than usual each afternoon. Most of all, Margaret noticed the look of quiet satisfaction that crossed Ashley's face whenever she believed the elderly widow had wandered into another moment of forgetfulness. Each evening when the house grew quiet, Margaret sat alone beside the window facing the street, the yellow glow of the porch light reflecting softly across the glass, and she thought carefully about what she had seen that day. The performance required patience and discipline, but Margaret Whitmore had spent a lifetime raising a son, managing a household, and navigating the unexpected turns that life sometimes delivered. Pretending to forget a few things was a small price to pay if it meant discovering exactly what Ashley Whitmore was planning to do next. By the beginning of the fourth week, the atmosphere inside the house on Maple Ridge Drive had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways, and Margaret Whitmore sensed that Ashley Whitmore had begun moving beyond curiosity into something far more deliberate. The shift first appeared on a quiet Thursday afternoon when Margaret wandered slowly into the kitchen pretending to search for the sugar jar, while Ashley sat at the dining table with a neat stack of documents spread out in front of her. Ashley quickly slid one paper on top of another when she noticed Margaret approaching, but not before Margaret recognized the shape of a property form printed on thick white legal paper. Margaret paused beside the refrigerator and stared at the magnets on the door as though she had forgotten what she had been looking for, giving Ashley just enough time to gather the papers and place them into the leather folder she had begun carrying everywhere. Later that evening, Margaret quietly retraced the moment in her mind. She remembered the way Ashley had studied the document, the careful concentration on her face, and the way her pen had hovered over the signature line as though she had been practicing the motion of writing a name. Over the next few days, the small clues multiplied. Margaret noticed that several old family folders had been removed from the study cabinet and returned in a different order. One afternoon, the cedar chest at the foot of Margaret's bed stood slightly open, and the velvet pouch containing a pair of gold cufflinks that had belonged to Thomas Whitmore had disappeared. When Margaret asked about the cufflinks in her slow, uncertain voice, Ashley responded immediately with a sympathetic smile and said that Margaret must have misplaced them somewhere in the house, gently suggesting that forgetfulness sometimes caused small things to vanish. Margaret nodded softly and pretended to accept the explanation, but inside she carefully added the missing cufflinks to the growing list of details she was quietly documenting in her mind. What Ashley did not realize was that Margaret had already begun preparing for this moment long before the cufflinks disappeared. 2 days after first noticing Ashley photographing the silver trays, Margaret had taken a short taxi ride across town to visit Harold Bennett, the attorney who had handled the Whitmore family estate for nearly 20 years. Sitting across from his large oak desk, Margaret had spoken clearly and calmly, explaining that she suspected someone inside her own home was slowly positioning themselves to take control of property that did not belong to them. Harold Bennett listened with the careful patience of a man who had spent decades handling complicated family matters, and before Margaret left his office they had quietly agreed on a plan. Over the following week, small security cameras were installed discreetly inside several rooms of the house, under the simple explanation that they were meant to help monitor Margaret's safety in case her memory problems worsened. Ashley herself had approved the idea without hesitation, even commenting that it was a responsible precaution for someone Margaret's age. Now each quiet movement inside the house was being recorded without Ashley ever realizing that every document she examined and every item she removed was quietly becoming part of a growing record. Margaret continued her careful performance each day, sometimes asking Ashley whether the grocery store was still open or wondering aloud how long she had lived in the house, While Ashley moved with increasing confidence through rooms she now seemed to believe would soon belong entirely to her. Yet each evening when Margaret sat in her armchair beside the window and watched the last cars drive slowly down Maple Ridge Drive, she allowed herself one small private smile, because with every passing day Ashley Whitmore was stepping deeper into a situation she believed she controlled, while Margaret Whitmore patiently allowed the truth to reveal itself piece by piece. In the days that followed, Margaret Whitmore noticed Ashley Whitmore becoming more confident than ever, moving through the house with the calm assurance of someone who believed she had already solved a complicated puzzle. The leather folder Ashley carried had grown thicker, and Margaret often saw her sitting at the dining table late in the afternoon studying papers with a focused expression that looked far too serious for ordinary household tasks. One quiet Monday morning, Margaret slowly walked into the living room and paused near the bookshelf as if she had forgotten why she had come there at all. Ashley was seated on the sofa with several documents spread across the coffee table, carefully comparing numbers written on two different pages. The moment Ashley noticed Margaret standing there, she quickly gathered the papers and placed them back inside the folder, offering the same gentle smile she had perfected over the past several weeks. She asked Margaret whether she needed help finding something and suggested that perhaps Margaret should sit down and rest because the morning air was still cool. Margaret nodded with a faintly puzzled expression and lowered herself into the armchair near the window, allowing Ashley to believe that nothing had been noticed. Yet from that quiet seat Margaret saw far more than Ashley realized. She noticed the envelope addressed from the county property records office. She noticed the printed form that required a homeowner's signature for a property transfer review. Most of all, she noticed the way Ashley's eyes lingered on the final page where a signature would normally appear. Over the next few days, Ashley began spending more time inside the study where Margaret had once kept every financial document organized with careful precision. Margaret pretended not to understand why Ashley was rearranging drawers and opening filing cabinets, occasionally asking whether the house had always been so large or whether Daniel had already come home from school, even though Daniel had been an adult for many years. Ashley responded patiently each time, speaking in the soft, reassuring tone people often use with someone they believe cannot fully follow a conversation. But each polite word only confirmed what Margaret already understood. Ashley believed the house no longer had an owner who could protect it. One afternoon, Margaret walked slowly down the hallway and stopped outside the study door just as Ashley spoke quietly on her phone. Margaret could not hear every word, but she clearly caught several phrases that echoed through the hallway with unmistakable meaning. Ashley mentioned property documentation, closing procedures, and the possibility of completing certain paperwork quickly if the current homeowner was no longer mentally capable of managing legal decisions. Margaret stood there silently with her hand resting against the wall, her expression distant and confused for anyone who might have looked at her in that moment, yet inside her mind every word was carefully recorded. That evening when the house grew quiet, Margaret sat beside the window watching the long shadows stretch across Maple Ridge Drive, while she replayed the conversation again and again in her memory. The situation was unfolding exactly as she had expected. Ashley Whitmore was no longer simply examining the house and its belongings. She was preparing to claim something much larger. And with each new step, Ashley believed she was moving closer to control of the Whitmore family home, never realizing that every document she studied, every phone call she made, and every quiet decision she took inside those walls was quietly becoming evidence that Margaret Whitmore had been patiently gathering since the day she decided to let the world believe her memory was fading. As the following week unfolded, Margaret Whitmore noticed that Ashley Whitmore no longer bothered to hide her intentions as carefully as before. The confidence in Ashley's movements had grown stronger, almost relaxed, as if she believed the most difficult part of her plan had already been completed. One quiet afternoon, Margaret slowly entered the kitchen and stood beside the counter studying a bowl of apples with the puzzled expression she had practiced so well. Ashley was seated at the table with her laptop open and several official-looking forms spread beside it. The sunlight from the back window illuminated the papers clearly enough for Margaret to recognize the bold lettering across the top of one page that read Property Transfer Authorization. Margaret tilted her head slightly and asked in a soft, uncertain voice whether the apples had always been kept in that bowl, or whether they had once belonged somewhere else in the house. Ashley responded with the same calm, reassuring tone she had adopted during the past month, and gently suggested that Margaret should sit down because standing too long might make her tired. Margaret obeyed slowly and lowered herself into the chair across the table, while Ashley turned the laptop screen away from her view. For several minutes Ashley typed quietly while glancing occasionally toward Margaret to confirm that the elderly widow appeared distracted by the simple act of turning an apple slowly in her hands. What Ashley did not realize was that Margaret had already seen enough to understand exactly what was happening. The documents on the table contained a series of forms that would allow someone to assume management of property on behalf of a homeowner who was considered mentally incapable of handling legal decisions. The signature line at the bottom of the page waited empty but ready. Over the next several days Ashley continued preparing the paperwork while speaking more frequently about the idea of helping Margaret move somewhere smaller and easier to manage. She mentioned pleasant retirement communities located about 20 miles away where residents enjoyed quiet apartments, daily meals, and organized activities. She described the idea as though it were a thoughtful solution to protect Margaret from the responsibilities of maintaining such a large house alone. Margaret listened carefully each time while nodding politely and occasionally asking questions that made her appear confused about where she had lived during the last several decades. Meanwhile, the small cameras installed inside the house continued recording every movement Ashley made, while handling the documents and organizing the family belongings. Several evenings later Margaret noticed something else that confirmed Ashley had crossed another line. A local antique dealer's truck pulled briefly into the driveway while Daniel was still at work. Ashley carried a small box out to the driver and returned inside looking satisfied but slightly cautious. That evening Margaret quietly checked the cedar chest again, and confirmed that several items that had belonged to Thomas Whitmore were no longer there. The list inside Margaret's mind grew longer with each passing day. Yet she never confronted Ashley. She never raised her voice or revealed that her memory was perfectly clear. Instead, Margaret Whitmore continued the quiet performance of confusion, while patiently allowing Ashley Whitmore to believe that every step she was taking was bringing her closer to complete control of the Whitmore home. What Ashley could not see was that each document she prepared and each family heirloom she removed was quietly strengthening the evidence that Margaret and her attorney Harold Bennett were carefully collecting piece by piece. The following week the situation inside the house reached a new level of boldness that even Margaret Whitmore had not fully expected. Ashley Whitmore had stopped pretending that the paperwork was simply part of ordinary household management, and had begun speaking openly about what she described as the next responsible step for Margaret's future. One cool morning Margaret sat quietly in the living room watching the early sunlight move slowly across the hardwood floor, while Ashley approached with a stack of documents neatly clipped together. Ashley spoke gently as she explained that she had arranged an appointment for Margaret to visit a comfortable senior residence about 30 minutes away where professional staff could provide daily assistance. She described walking paths, organized social events, and the convenience of having meals prepared every day. Margaret looked down at the papers in her hands as though she were trying to understand something written in a language she no longer recognized. Ashley pointed to several sections of the documents and calmly explained that these forms would allow Ashley to help manage the house and financial responsibilities, while Margaret adjusted to a quieter lifestyle. Margaret allowed her hands to tremble slightly as she held the papers and asked in a soft voice whether Daniel knew about these plans. Ashley replied that Daniel trusted her judgment completely, and believed this arrangement would make life easier for everyone involved. Later that afternoon Daniel returned home from work and briefly discussed the idea with Ashley in the kitchen. Margaret listened from the hallway as Ashley explained that Margaret had been forgetting simple things more often, and that it might be safer if someone else handled the legal responsibilities of the property. Daniel sounded uncertain but tired, the voice of someone balancing long workdays with family obligations. Ashley reassured him that everything would be handled properly, and that Margaret would be comfortable in a peaceful environment designed for seniors. Meanwhile, the cameras inside the house quietly recorded every moment of these conversations, and every document that Ashley placed carefully inside the leather folder. That evening Margaret made another short visit to Harold Bennett's office where she calmly reviewed the growing collection of recorded footage and scanned documents. Harold Bennett studied the evidence carefully and explained that Ashley had moved beyond curiosity and into actions that could be legally challenged if presented clearly. Margaret listened patiently and nodded with quiet determination. She understood that the final step of Ashley's plan would come soon, because Ashley now believed the elderly widow had no ability to recognize what was happening around her. When Margaret returned home later that night she resumed her familiar role, slowly walking through the hallway and pausing beside the staircase as though she had forgotten where her bedroom was located. Ashley passed by her with a reassuring smile and guided her gently toward the stairs while explaining that tomorrow would be an important day for signing a few simple papers that would help organize the future. Margaret Whitmore nodded slowly and allowed Ashley Whitmore to believe that the moment of complete control was finally within reach, while deep inside Margaret's clear and patient mind she knew that the trap she had carefully prepared for weeks was about to close. The next morning arrived with a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if the quiet suburban street itself understood that something important was about to unfold inside the Whitmore house on Maple Ridge Drive. Margaret Whitmore sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded loosely in front of her, her pale blue cardigan draped across her shoulders as she slowly stirred a cup of tea that had already grown lukewarm. Ashley Whitmore moved around the kitchen with unusual energy, placing a neat stack of documents on the table and adjusting them carefully so that the pages lined up perfectly. She spoke in the patient voice she had been using for weeks, explaining that the paperwork was simply a formality that would allow her to help manage the house and finances, while Margaret settled into a more comfortable living arrangement. Margaret stared down at the pages as if the printed words were impossible to understand, tilting her head slightly and asking whether the house had always been located on Maple Ridge Drive, or if they had once lived somewhere else entirely. Ashley smiled reassuringly and gently slid a pen toward Margaret, pointing to the line where a signature would normally appear. Daniel stood near the doorway watching the scene with uncertain eyes, clearly trusting his wife's explanation that these documents would make things easier for everyone. Margaret lifted the pen slowly and held it above the paper for several seconds, her hand trembling slightly as though the act of writing had become a difficult puzzle. Ashley leaned closer with a patient smile and softly repeated that Margaret only needed to sign her name. Instead, Margaret placed the pen back on the table and looked up with the same distant expression she had perfected over the past several weeks. She asked whether Harold Bennett had already arrived, because she remembered he sometimes helped with important paperwork. Ashley froze for a brief moment before quickly recovering her calm tone and explaining that there was no reason to involve an attorney for such a simple matter. At that exact moment, a quiet knock echoed through the front door. Ashley turned toward the hallway with visible confusion while Daniel stepped forward to answer it. Standing on the porch was Harold Bennett holding a slim briefcase and wearing the composed expression of a man who had expected this exact moment. Ashley's smile faded as he entered the house and greeted Margaret politely before placing several printed photographs and documents on the kitchen table. The images clearly showed Ashley removing items from the cedar chest, photographing legal papers in the study, and meeting with the antique dealer in the driveway. The security camera footage had recorded every detail with perfect clarity. Ashley stared at the evidence in silence while Margaret slowly straightened her posture and looked directly at her for the first time in weeks without the slightest hint of confusion in her eyes. The trembling uncertainty disappeared from Margaret's hands as she folded them calmly in front of her and spoke in a steady voice that carried across the quiet kitchen. She explained that she had remembered every single moment since the day Ashley first began examining the family belongings. She described the photographs, the missing heirlooms, the phone conversations about transferring property, and the documents that Ashley had prepared to gain control of the house. Daniel looked from the evidence on the table to his mother, and then to his wife as the truth settled over the room with a quiet but undeniable weight. Margaret Whitmore had never forgotten anything at all. She had simply been waiting patiently while Ashley Whitmore revealed exactly what she believed she could take. For several long seconds the kitchen remained completely silent as the weight of Margaret Whitmore's words settled into the room. Ashley Whitmore stood frozen beside the table, her hand still resting on the stack of documents that only minutes earlier she had expected Margaret to sign without question. Daniel looked down at the photograph spread across the table, and then slowly lifted one of them, studying the clear image of Ashley removing a velvet pouch from the cedar chest in the bedroom. His expression changed from confusion to disbelief, as he recognized the familiar heirlooms that had belonged to his father for decades. Ashley attempted to speak, but the calm confidence she had carried for weeks was gone. She tried to explain that everything had been misunderstood, and that she had only been organizing the household because Margaret seemed unable to keep track of things. Harold Bennett listened quietly before sliding another printed document across the table, this one showing the draft property transfer form Ashley had begun preparing along with the time-stamped camera images that recorded each step of the process. Margaret remained seated in her chair, her posture now steady and composed. the gentle confusion she had performed for weeks completely gone. She explained calmly that the cameras had recorded every item that had been removed from the house and every document that had been photographed. The antique dealer's visit, the missing cufflinks, the legal forms discussing property control, all of it had been documented carefully and stored with Harold Bennett for review. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, asking Ashley if there was any part of the evidence that was not true. Ashley looked from Daniel to Margaret and then toward the front door as if searching for an escape from a situation she had never expected to face. The comfortable control she believed she had gained over the house had disappeared in a single moment. Harold Bennett then explained in a clear professional tone that the documents Ashley had prepared could not legally transfer ownership, because Margaret Whitmore had never been declared mentally incapable, and had never authorized anyone else to act on her behalf. In addition, the recorded footage showing the removal and attempted sale of family heirlooms could be reviewed by authorities if necessary. Ashley slowly lowered herself into the chair across from Margaret, the confidence in her voice completely gone. The quiet suburban house that she had believed would soon belong to her now felt very different. Margaret watched the reaction without anger or raised voice, simply observing the consequences of choices Ashley had made while believing no one was paying attention. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon sun moved slowly across the quiet street, illuminating the familiar front lawns and the row of mailboxes that lined Maple Ridge Drive. Inside the house, the truth had finally surfaced, not through shouting or confrontation but through patience and careful planning. Margaret Whitmore folded her hands calmly on the table and looked directly at Ashley, explaining that she had given her every opportunity to show honesty during the past several weeks. Instead, Ashley had chosen to treat the elderly widow as someone who could be easily manipulated. Daniel set the photograph back on the table and stepped away from the doorway, realizing that the situation unfolding in front of him was not a misunderstanding but the result of deliberate actions that had been carefully recorded from the beginning. The silence inside the Whitmore kitchen lingered long after the truth had been laid out across the table, and for the first time since the entire situation had begun, Ashley Whitmore no longer seemed certain of what to say or where to look. Daniel stood quietly near the counter with his arms resting against the edge, staring down at the photographs and documents that now explained the strange changes he had noticed over the past month but had never fully understood. Margaret Whitmore remained seated calmly in her chair, her posture straight and steady, the same woman who had once managed every detail of the household long before anyone believed she had forgotten how. Harold Bennett gathered several of the documents into a neat stack, and explained that the evidence already collected was more than enough to protect Margaret's legal ownership of the home and the property connected to it. He spoke carefully and clearly so that everyone in the room understood exactly what had been documented, and what could happen if the situation were taken further through legal channels. Ashley listened with her eyes fixed on the table, while the quiet confidence that had guided her actions for weeks seemed to fade completely. Margaret did not raise her voice or express anger. Instead, she spoke with the calm tone of someone who had already accepted the outcome long before the moment arrived. She explained that the Whitmore house had been built through decades of work and careful planning by her and her late husband Thomas, and every object inside it carried memories that could never simply be treated as items on a list of valuables. She said that trust inside a family was more important than any piece of silver or any legal document, and once that trust had been broken, it could not be easily restored. Daniel finally stepped forward and looked directly at his mother, realizing that the confusion he had believed for weeks had never existed at all. Margaret told him quietly that she had not revealed the truth earlier, because she needed to understand exactly how far the situation would go before taking action. The evidence now sitting on the table had provided that answer clearly. Harold Bennett then closed his briefcase and informed Ashley that several items removed from the house would need to be returned immediately, and that any future legal discussion about property or finances would go directly through Margaret and her attorney. Ashley slowly stood from her chair, without speaking, and walked toward the hallway, understanding that the position she had once believed was secure had disappeared completely. Daniel remained behind, looking once more at the photographs that documented every step of the plan that had quietly unfolded inside the house he had grown up in. Margaret rose from her seat and walked slowly to the window overlooking Maple Ridge Drive, where the late afternoon light spread across the quiet street, just as it had every day for decades. For weeks she had allowed the world around her to believe that her memory had faded into confusion, But now the house was silent again and the truth was finally clear. Margaret Whitmore had never forgotten anything at all, and by allowing patience and careful observation to guide her decisions she had protected the home, the memories within it, and the future she had built over a lifetime.